The precise arc of a compass, the whisper of graphite on aged vellum, these were the rhythms of my world. I, Reid, found solace in the meticulous reconstruction of forgotten landscapes, in giving form to history's blurred edges. Each river bend, every vanished settlement, every ancient road resurfaced beneath my hand was a small victory against the tide of oblivion. My desk, a scarred oak expanse, was a universe of calipers, magnifying lenses, and the faint, sweet scent of archival paper. Today, it held the ghost of an 18th-century trade route, its intricate pathways demanding an unwavering focus, a clarity of vision that few possessed. The summons arrived not as a crackling missive from a bygone era, but as a stiff, formal letter from a solicitor's firm, its modern typeface a jarring intrusion. A distant relative, a name barely a whisper in the annals of my family's fragmented memory, had passed, leaving behind an estate. An ancestral home, the letter stated, remote and in need of considerable attention. I read the words, considerable attention, and my mind, accustomed to precision, translated them into utter dereliction. Yet, a flicker of something, perhaps a professional curiosity for a new, uncharted territory, stirred within me. The journey was a slow unraveling, the landscape gradually shedding the familiar contours of modernity. Paved roads gave way to gravel tracks, then to rutted paths swallowed by encroaching foliage. The air grew heavy, carrying the damp perfume of earth and decay, a scent both ancient and alive. When the estate finally emerged from behind a curtain of gnarled oaks, it was less a house and more a monument to erosion. Stone walls wept moss, windows were black, vacant eyes, and the roof sagged like a tired spine. The silence here was profound, a living thing that pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through broken panes. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of generations, a fine, gray powder that coated every surface, preserving the last moments of its inhabitants in a fragile shroud. It wasn't merely the decay that disturbed, it was the palpable weight of absence, the feeling that something had not merely left, but had been removed. The solicitor, a stoic man whose face seemed carved from the same gray stone as the estate, had left a single, locked chest in what appeared to be the library. The family's most treasured possessions, he'd offered, his voice flat, before retreating with an almost desperate haste. The chest itself was a heavy oak affair, banded with tarnished brass, its surface scarred by time and perhaps, neglect. My fingers worked the rusty clasp, a small, metallic sigh escaping as it finally yielded. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens and brittle daguerreotypes of stern, unsmiling faces, lay a map. My breath caught. It was not a printed chart, but a handmade creation, its parchment thick and supple despite its apparent age, emitting a faint, earthy aroma. The ink, a deep, almost black hue, was remarkably vibrant, as if applied yesterday. I spread it carefully on the library's dusty reading table, its weight surprisingly substantial. My cartographer's eye immediately recognized its exceptional quality. The detail was exquisite, almost obsessive. Every copse of trees, every winding stream, every undulation of the land within the estate's considerable boundaries was rendered with an unnerving precision. I saw ancient walls, long crumbled to rubble, delineated as if they still stood proud. Paths I had struggled to discern through the overgrown wilderness were here, sharp and clear, leading to features I could not yet place. This was more than a record, it was an intimate portrait of the land, drawn by someone who knew its every secret. Yet, it was incomplete. Large sections, particularly towards the estate's northernmost reaches, were left starkly blank, pristine parchment untouched by ink. Even more unsettling were the symbols interspersed throughout the map sections, small, intricate glyphs, not decorative, but appearing almost as marginalia, clinging to the edges of certain features, a moss-choked well, a cluster of ancient standing stones, a particularly dense thicket. They were unlike any cartographic symbols I had ever encountered, hinting at a language or a meaning entirely alien to my professional lexicon. They pulsed with an unspoken significance, a silent accusation. My gaze lingered on a series of faint, almost invisible lines near the estate's western boundary, lines that seemed to suggest an underground network, a labyrinth beneath the very earth. The implications were immense, challenging everything I thought I knew about this forgotten place. Professional curiosity, usually a calm, intellectual pursuit, now mingled with a growing sense of unease. This was not merely an old map, it was a puzzle, a coded message from the past, and it felt heavy with an unspoken burden. For a fleeting, disorienting second, the musty library dissolved. I was elsewhere, in a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. Then, just as swiftly, the walls of the library solidified around me, the earthy scent of the old parchment filling my nostrils once more. The jarring memory, a fragment from some unremembered ordeal, receded, leaving behind only a faint tremor in my hands. I ran a finger over one of the blank spaces, then traced the line of an unknown symbol. This map, this anomaly, demanded completion. It called to the very core of my being, an irresistible challenge. I would uncover the secrets it held, no matter how deeply buried, no matter what unsettling truths might lie beneath the land. I, Reid, would finish this map. The meticulous dance of graphite across vellum had always anchored me, a tether to the tangible world. But the map, that unsettling heirloom, promised a different rhythm, one that pulled at the very ground beneath my feet. My boots crunched on gravel path choked with moss, a path that, according to the map, should have led to a small, ornamental fountain. Instead, a tangle of ancient, grasping rhododendrons clawed at the air, their gnarled branches forming an impenetrable wall. I consulted the map again, its brittle edges fluttering in the faint breeze. There, precisely where the dense thicket now stood, was a clear, circular etching, labeled with an archaic script I could barely decipher as Water's Whisper. This was the first discord, a tangible defiance of the paper's authority. I pushed through the foliage, my hands scraping against rough bark, only to find nothing but earthen roots, the ghost of the fountain swallowed whole by the voracious growth. It was as if the very land had conspired to erase it, a deliberate act of concealment. Further on, the map indicated a small, ancillary structure, perhaps a gardener's shed or a summer house. I navigated by the compass, my gaze sweeping the overgrown landscape. What I found was a collapsed heap of timber and stone, almost entirely subsumed by ivy and wild brambles, its form barely discernible beneath the green shroud. The air around the collapsed structure felt heavy, stagnant, as if time itself had congealed there. When I reached the spot, pushing aside curtains of drooping willow branches, I found them. Not fruit trees, but crude, upright stones, perhaps 2 feet high, weathered, and scarred by centuries of exposure. They were not arranged in any obvious pattern of cultivation or demarcation. They felt ancient, unsettling, like teeth protruding from the earth, their purpose utterly alien to my cartographer's mind. What did they mark? What did they guard? My breath misted before me. The air grew still, heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I stood abruptly, scanning the surroundings, but the trees were motionless, the sky clear. I shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. A low, resonant hum began then, deep within the earth, a vibration that resonated more in my chest than in my ears. It was not a mechanical sound, nor the thrum of distant traffic. It was organic, almost a sigh, yet too deep, too sustained for any creature I knew. It seemed to pulse beneath the very soil, a slow, rhythmic beat that amplified the stillness of the air, making every rustle of leaf, every chirp of bird, feel like an intrusion. Now, a dissonant chord had been struck. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to tap a frantic, irregular beat against my ribs. I felt a profound sense of disorientation, a sudden, jarring displacement. For a fleeting, impossible moment, the rustling leaves of the ancient trees dissolved, replaced by the hushed, sterile gleam of polished linoleum. My breath caught in my throat. Then, with a gasp, the vision shattered. The gnarled branches of the willow trees were real again, the hum of the earth a phantom echo. But the fear remained, a fresh, sharp barb in my mind, leaving me shaken and profoundly unnerved. The quiet hum of the estate had begun to change, a subtle shift from the creaks of aging timber to something more insistent, a whisper against the silence that settled around me like dust motes in sunbeams. I, Reid, found myself increasingly listening for it, a new and unwelcome cadence in the ancestral halls. My meticulous nature, once a shield against the erratic, now felt like a sieve, letting through particles of dread I couldn't grasp. The map lay spread across the great oak table in my study, a silent accusation. I had spent hours hunched over it, my magnifying glass tracing the delicate lines, trying to find the flaw, the misplaced mark that explained the unease that had rooted itself in my gut. But the flaw, I was slowly beginning to suspect, wasn't on the parchment. It was in the very air I breathed. Flickers at the edge of my vision, gone before I could turn my head. I blamed the old house, its eccentric angles, the way the late afternoon light sliced through leaded glass, creating phantom dancers on the walls. I blamed my own exhaustion, the long hours spent poring over ancient texts, the isolation that stretched like a taut wire between me and the nearest living soul. Just the mind playing tricks, I'd tell myself, my voice a dry rustle in the cavernous room. At first, they were indistinguishable from the wind sighing through ill-fitting window frames, or the groan of settling foundations. A low, sibilant murmur, like dry leaves skittering across flagstones. But they grew clearer, or perhaps my ears grew keener, attuned to the insidious sound. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, a faint, almost melodic current, always just out of reach of full comprehension. Words, or fragments of words, seemed to coalesce and then dissolve, like smoke rings in a draught. They spoke of lineage, of earth, of a long-buried hunger. I found myself holding my breath, straining against the quiet, desperate to catch a full phrase, to prove to myself that it was merely the old plumbing, or a draft, or the wind. But the proof never came, only the receding echo of something I couldn't quite grasp. One morning, I found my compass, which I'd left carefully aligned on the northwest corner of the map, inexplicably turned, its brass needle pointing due south. Later, a small, worn leather-bound volume on local flora, which I distinctly remembered placing on the top shelf of the study's central bookcase, lay open on the floor beside my armchair, its spine cracked, a page marked with a dried, brittle leaf I didn't recognize. These were minor shifts, easily dismissed. A forgotten moment of absent-mindedness. A clumsy brush of my arm. The house settling. Yet, the frequency of these small disturbances began to prickle at the edges of my composure. Each rearranged object, each subtle displacement, eroded another sliver of my carefully constructed logic. The map itself began to shift, to betray me. I would leave it for the night, its parchment a pale, static landscape. But upon my return, I would find faint, almost imperceptible changes. A tiny, almost invisible glyph, resembling a crude, ancient symbol I'd glimpsed in some obscure genealogical text, would seem to have deepened its etching, its edges sharper, more pronounced. It was never a drastic alteration, never something I could definitively point to and say, this was not here before. It was more insidious, a slow, creeping transformation that made me doubt my own memory, my own meticulous observation. Had I simply overlooked these details? Was I projecting my growing unease onto the inert vellum? Sleep, when it came, offered no solace. The nightmares were vivid, relentless, twisting the familiar into grotesque parodies. I dreamt of being buried alive, the earth pressing down with an unbearable weight, the air growing thin, heavy with the scent of damp soil and something metallic, like old blood. I dreamt of the house itself, its walls breathing, its foundations sinking into a maw of mud and roots, pulling me down with it. Then, there was the dream of the hallway. The machines pulsed with a faint, rhythmic thrum, their indicator lights glowing like malevolent eyes in the gloom. A sense of wrongness, of being trapped in a place I didn't belong, yet was inextricably linked to. The logical facade I had so carefully constructed around these phenomena began to crack, splintering into shards of doubt. They were a chorus, growing louder, more insistent, singing a discordant tune that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my sanity. It was alive. And it was reaching for me. The whispers had not truly ceased, they merely receded, a tide of murmurs withdrawing to the farthest reaches of my hearing, leaving behind an exposed, trembling shore. I felt them still, a pressure behind my eyes, a tremor in the air itself, demanding answers. The map, with its stark, unsettling lines, had become an anchor point in a sea of unraveling sanity, and I clung to it with a desperate grip. If it held a truth, it also held a key, and I intended to force its lock. My days blurred into a single, relentless pursuit. I plunged into the estate's forgotten archives, a labyrinth of dust and decay. The library, long abandoned, offered little beyond moldering fiction. It was in the lesser-known nooks, the forgotten studies, and the damp, root-choked cellar where the true hoard lay. I unearthed ancient, leather-bound journals from locked chests, their clasps corroded, their pages brittle as autumn leaves. Cryptic letters, tied with faded ribbons, spilled from the back of a collapsed bureau. Local almanacs, their covers gnawed by time and vermin, spoke of harvests and hearths, but also, in hushed asides, of the land's peculiarities. The air in these forgotten spaces was thick with the scent of mildewed paper, dry rot, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood, or perhaps just the lingering breath of trapped memories. My fingers, stained with grime and ink, traced the spidery script of generations past. Each entry, each faded word, was a shard of a shattered mirror, reflecting a creeping darkness. First, a mention of unsettling dreams, then a strange malaise amongst the livestock, followed by the inexplicable disappearance of a stable hand. Alistair's elegant handwriting grew erratic, his entries shorter, punctuated by hurried scrawls and increasingly desperate pleas to understand the soil. He detailed strange growths in the woods, patches where the earth seemed to weep a viscous, black ichor. The peculiar, almost musical hum that would emanate from the ground near the ancient standing stones, a place clearly marked on my map. His final entry was a single, stark sentence, smeared and barely legible. It asks for more than I can give. I found a collection of letters from a century later, exchanged between a great-aunt, Ilara, and a concerned family friend. Ilara's early correspondence was bright, full of plans for the estate. But as the years turned, her tone soured. The letters grew frantic, her handwriting jagged. Isolde, the letters concluded, had vanished without a trace, leaving only a small, carved wooden bird by the well's edge. Generations of my lineage, each touched by the land's strange influence, each succumbing to a similar trajectory of unease, then madness, then disappearance. The specific locations mentioned in the journals and letters corresponded precisely to the cryptic markings on my incomplete map: the standing stones, the weeping earth, the well, the gully. My breath hitched. The map wasn't merely a guide to the estate's physical features, it was a morbid ledger, a chronicle of the land's depredations, a key to something malevolent. My cartographer's instinct, once a source of calm precision, now thrummed with a frantic, desperate energy. The ink seemed to pulse, the paper to writhe. The air in the dusty study grew heavy, pressing in on me, stealing the oxygen from my lungs. My vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into a gray haze. A low, rhythmic hum filled the space, a mechanical exhalation and inhalation, like a vast, unseen lung. Was this a memory? A premonition? Or had the fragile construct of my mind finally fractured? The hum receded. I was back in the study, the journal still clutched in my trembling hand, the scent of mildew and old paper assaulting my senses. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. The hallucination, or whatever it had been, had left me gasping, disoriented, my skin clammy. The experience only intensified my resolve. This was no mere inheritance, it was an inheritance of horror, and I was its latest, unwilling recipient. I needed to finish the map, not just to complete a task, but to understand the full extent of the malevolence that now stirred beneath the very ground I stood upon, waiting. The weight of Ilara's words pressed against my chest, a cold, heavy hand. The creeping melancholy, she'd called it. The estate, once a haven of quiet study, had become a chamber of echoing anxieties. The map lay open on the vast oak table, its incomplete lines mocking my meticulous nature. My eyes, weary from lack of true rest, began to play tricks. The shadows cast by the flickering gaslight seemed to coalesce, forming fleeting shapes in the periphery of my vision, a hunched figure in the doorway, a pair of eyes gleaming from the corner of the room. I would whip my head around, my breath catching, only to find the familiar emptiness, the quiet stillness of the ancestral home. Yet, the sensation of being observed never truly receded. It was a constant prickle on my nape, a whisper of cold air against my cheek even when the windows were sealed tight. They no longer blended into the wind's sigh or the creak of old timber. They were threats, clear and unmistakable, claiming ownership over something I couldn't quite grasp, yet felt intimately connected to my presence here. One evening, as I attempted to sketch a detail from the map, my charcoal stick snapped with a sharp crack, despite the gentleness of my grip. A moment later, a heavy tome of local history, perched precariously on a shelf across the room, slid off and crashed to the floor, its pages fanning out like a startled bird. This was no settling house. This was intent. The very air in the study grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The flame in the gaslight flickered wildly, dancing as if caught in a sudden draft that I could not feel. I heard the faint, rhythmic thump of something moving in the floorboards above me, a slow, deliberate pacing that was too heavy for a rodent, too steady for a branch scraping the roof. My gaze shot to the ceiling, imagining the unseen entity directly overhead, mirroring my movements, a silent, malevolent sentinel. I tried to call out, to reach for a lifeline beyond the encroaching gloom of the estate. My hand trembled as I lifted the antique telephone receiver. The dial tone was a weak, wavering hum, then nothing. I pressed the buttons again, harder this time, a frantic staccato against the plastic, but the line remained stubbornly dead. I tried my mobile phone. No signal. I walked to the edge of the property, straining to catch a single bar, but the vast, ancient trees seemed to absorb all connectivity, leaving me marooned. The world outside, the world of reason and logic, had receded, leaving me to face this nameless horror alone. The exhaustion was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pulled at my eyelids. Yet, when I finally succumbed to sleep, it offered no respite. The visions that had flickered at the edges of my waking mind now consumed my dreams. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, disquieting drone, casting a sickly yellow glow on the sterile walls. The air was thick with the faint, metallic scent of antiseptic and something else, something cloying and sweet, like decay. The rhythmic whoosh whoosh of a ventilator echoed from behind a closed door, a mechanical sigh. It was a vision of utter desolation, a premonition of my own fate, perhaps, a place where life was sustained artificially, without warmth or true presence. I awoke with a gasp, the phantom scent of antiseptic clinging to my nostrils. As I sat bolt upright, a framed photograph of a stern-faced ancestor, perched on the mantelpiece, slid silently to the floor. I stared at the broken shards, then at the empty space where the portrait had been. It was no accident. It was a declaration. The creeping melancholy had found its voice, and it was demanding my attention. My isolation was complete, and the estate, once my inheritance, had become my cage. The estate had become a crucible, every shadow a question, every creak of the ancient timbers a whispered suspicion. It was a pervasive chill, an invisible hand on the nape of my neck that intensified the deeper I delved into the map. I worked without sleep, fueled by a frantic determination, the scent of aged paper and dust my only companion. Days bled into nights. I pored over the estate's archives, dusty journals, and cryptic ledgers, seeking an echo, a resonance with the unsettling lines etched onto the parchment. The map, my singular obsession, began to reveal its true, horrifying face. It wasn't a map of property lines or hidden caches of coins. It was a diagram of restraint. The intricate patterns I had once dismissed as decorative flourishes now resolved into sigils, ancient wards, and interlocking chains of symbols. The lines were not paths, but conduits, the shaded areas not groves, but anchors. The estate, in its entirety, was not merely built on the land, but around something. A particularly dense section of the map, marked by a starburst of overlapping glyphs, drew my gaze like a lodestone. Beside it, barely legible beneath centuries of foxing, was a passage in a dialect I barely recognized, a forgotten tongue of my ancestors, which I had only ever encountered in fragments within the estate's oldest texts. My eyes, burning from strain, traced the archaic script. The words coalesced, forming a narrative far more terrifying than any ghost story. The starburst on the map was not a marker of power, but of imprisonment. This place, this ancestral land, was a prison. A seal. The creeping melancholy was not just a mood, it was the slow, insidious seepage of that entity's presence, its awakening breath. The text continued, detailing how the seal was maintained, generation after generation, by a meticulous, almost ritualistic care of the land, an unbroken chain of guardianship. But the last lines, scrawled in a frantic, deteriorating hand, spoke of decay, of neglect. The bonds weaken. The stone weeps. I was not here to merely chart a property, I was here because the seal was failing. The map, once my passion, was now a blueprint for an impending disaster, a desperate plea from the past. Every line I had meticulously traced, every contour I had filled, had been an act of unwitting participation. Was I meant to complete it, to reinforce the failing containment, or was my very presence, my focused attention on the map, somehow accelerating its demise? A sudden, disorienting shift occurred. The study dissolved. The machines, unseen but heard, pulsed with a rhythmic, mechanical sigh, like great, indifferent lungs. The silence was profound, broken only by the quiet respiration of the unseen devices, a sound that felt less like life and more like an endless, automated vigil. This place, whatever it was, felt like the inside of a tomb, meticulously maintained yet utterly desolate. Then, as abruptly as it began, the hallucination receded, leaving me gasping for air, clutching the ancient map like a lifeline. I was back in the study, the familiar scent of old paper a grounding anchor. The entity. It wasn't just ancient, it was cosmic in its scope, a force that predated human understanding, buried beneath my ancestral home. That creeping melancholy was its slow, deliberate exhalation, its reaching tendrils of influence. I had been drawn here, not by chance, but by lineage, by blood. My ancestors had been its keepers, and now, the mantle had fallen to me, a solitary cartographer, armed with a crumbling map and a terrifying revelation. The weight of it settled on me, a crushing burden. The estate was not merely decaying, it was dying, and with it, the prison. The air in the study thickened, not with dust, but with an unseen pressure. The silence stretched, taut and brittle, until I could almost hear the slow, deliberate pulse of something vast and terrible stirring deep beneath the earth, beneath the very floorboards where I stood. I was not just an inheritor, I was a pawn in a game generations old, a game I was only just beginning to comprehend, and one I was already losing. The map, once a key to understanding, was now a mirror reflecting my own impending doom. The cold dread, sharp and absolute, had pierced through the exhaustion, leaving me hollowed out, yet acutely aware. Every line I had meticulously traced, every curve, every shadowed contour, now felt less like a discovery and more like an incantation, unwound. Then, the world warped. One moment, my fingers were tracing the brittle vellum of the map, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and damp earth from the cellar. The floor beneath my boots was no longer packed soil but smooth, cool linoleum. Doors lined both sides, identical and anonymous, their surfaces reflecting the pale light with a dull sheen. It was a place of suspended animation, a liminal space where time seemed to stretch and thin. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My rational mind screamed, but my senses betrayed me. The coolness of the air on my skin, the faint vibrations through the floor, the unsettling clarity of the machine sounds, they were all too vivid. This was the entity. This was its touch, a forced journey into a landscape of its own making, or perhaps, a glimpse into the fractured reality it inhabited. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and resonant, yet singular in its intent. You have come. They vibrated through my very marrow, threatening to unravel me. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms, trying to anchor myself to something tangible, anything that wasn't this encroaching madness. The lines you traced. They lead. To me. The chorus intensified, a low thrum that promised both understanding and annihilation. The seal weakens. The path. This was it. The direct confrontation I had feared, yet unknowingly sought. This was not a haunting, it was a conversation, a demand. To claim me. My thoughts, once my own, felt suddenly permeable, exposed. Join. Us. Complete. The work. A profound resistance welled up from somewhere deep within me, a primal refusal to yield. I focused on the one thing that still felt solid, the map. The map was the key. It had to be. As I fought, a fragment of memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the entity's assault. It wasn't my memory, but a flicker from an ancestral mind, a desperate, final thought caught in the ether. It was a symbol, etched not on paper, but into a vision of damp, ancient stone beneath the earth. A circle, broken and incomplete, within which rested a single, jagged shard. And beside it, a series of precise, almost mathematical gestures. A ritual. A countermeasure. The vision coalesced, bringing with it a terrible understanding. The entity was not merely sealed, it was contained by a resonance, a specific frequency of will and sacrifice. The map wasn't just a blueprint for its prison, it was a diagram for its re-imprisonment. But the missing piece, the jagged shard within the broken circle, represented the cost. Foolish. Resistance. The entity's voice wavered, a hint of frustration in its vastness. You cannot escape. Your blood is ours. The sacrifice. It was not merely an object. A severing. A final, absolute break with the bloodline that had bound this thing to the land, and to me. To reseal it, I would have to become the last, to extinguish the very connection that had brought me here. If I failed, if I allowed the entity to fully possess me, it would not only consume this land, but it would use my bloodline, my very being, as a conduit to spread beyond the estate, to twist and warp the world. My ancestors hadn't just sealed it, they had unknowingly tethered it to their descendants, to me. And the only way to truly contain it again was to sever that tether, completely and irrevocably. The ultimate act of will. The ultimate sacrifice. The dim hallway began to pulse with a faint, crimson light from the unseen machines. The rhythmic breathing grew louder, more insistent, like a predator closing in. I could feel the entity's impatience, its hunger. It wanted me to break, to surrender, to complete the cycle of its release. But the vision of the broken circle, the jagged shard, and the terrible, beautiful clarity of the sacrifice burned in my mind. I was Reid, the cartographer. And I had a map, a terrible, demanding map, that now showed me the way to my own undoing, for the sake of everything else. The choice, stark and agonizing, was mine. The truth had clawed its way into my waking mind, a brutal, undeniable revelation. The severing. Not of a physical thing, but of a thread, gossamer thin yet unbreakable, woven through generations. My thread. To reseal the horror beneath this land, to silence the whispers that now echoed even in the daylight, I had to cut myself free. A final, absolute break with the bloodline that had bound this thing to the earth, and to me. I stood before the yawning maw of the forgotten crypt, hidden beneath the crumbling mausoleum in the estate's darkest corner. My lamp cast a nervous, flickering glow, pushing back the absolute blackness that seemed to surge at the edges of the beam. It was a premonition. My hand, unsteady, traced the cold stone of the arch. This was it. The point of no return. The entity knew. I could feel its awareness pressing in, a heavy, unseen weight against my temples. It had begun its assault the moment I had committed, a subtle unraveling of my perception. A sudden shift. The crypt entrance warped, its rough stones softening, smoothing. The musty air grew sterile, bleached. The smell of decay vanished, replaced by an antiseptic tang. I blinked, confused. My lamp was gone. Instead, fluorescent lights hummed with a low, artificial glow above a long, polished corridor. I was no longer in the crypt. My blood turned to ice. This was its trick. A disorientation. The rhythmic thump-thump of a distant monitor echoed, a false heartbeat in an empty world. Every door along the corridor was closed, identical, unyielding. Where was the crypt? Where was the path? I forced myself to breathe, to push back the encroaching panic. This was not real. I closed my eyes, focusing on the rough texture of the crypt stone, the smell of damp earth, the precise coordinates I had mapped. When I opened them again, the sterile hallway flickered, shimmered like heat haze, then dissolved. I was back. The crypt entrance loomed, unchanged. The lamp was in my hand, its light unwavering. It was trying to break me before I even began. I descended into the crypt, each step echoing with an unsettling finality. The air grew heavier, thick and cloying, like breathing through wet wool. The passage narrowed, the walls pressing in, slick with moisture. My lamp illuminated grotesque carvings on the stone, half eroded by time and dampness, figures with elongated limbs, their faces contorted in silent screams, or perhaps silent reverence. They promised release, oblivion, and end to the madness if I would only stop. They offered power, knowledge, if I would only join. They were my own thoughts, twisted, amplified, turned against me. Why fight it, Reid? It is your heritage. Embrace it. You belong to it. I pressed deeper, my boots squelching in a thin layer of viscous mud that coated the floor. The passage opened into a vast, vaulted chamber, its ceiling lost in the gloom above. This was the heart of it. The place where the bloodline had first been bound. As I approached the dais, the air grew frigid, biting at my exposed skin. My breath plumed white. The carvings on the walls seemed to deepen, the figures now writhing with a horrifying animation, their stone eyes fixed on me. Then, the floor itself began to shift. Not merely the mud, but the bedrock. Cracks spider-webbed across the ancient stone, growing wider, deeper, with a grinding, tearing sound. It shimmered with an inner light, a faint, sickly green. The entity was not merely trying to tempt me, it was actively trying to consume the very ground beneath my feet, to trap me in its embrace. The chamber groaned, a living thing in agony or ecstasy. I stumbled, nearly falling into the spreading ooze. It was trying to break my will, to make me abandon the task, to make me yield. But I would not. My ancestors' folly had bound this thing, and my blood would sever it. My hand tightened on the blade, its edge catching the lamp's light. The sacrifice would be made. The severing would be complete. The vast, vaulted chamber swallowed the weak glow of my lantern, its ceiling a distant, unknowable height. The air here was not merely cold, it was a profound absence of warmth, a vacuum that seemed to draw the very heat from my bones. In the center, the dais of black, unpolished stone gleamed, not with reflected light, but with an inner, predatory sheen. This was the heart. This was where it slept, and where it now stirred. A low thrum vibrated through the stone beneath my boots, a sound felt more than heard, resonating deep within my chest cavity. It was the hum of something ancient awakening, a slow, deliberate stretch of malevolence. My lantern beam danced across the rough-hewn walls, revealing crude, swirling symbols carved into the rock, patterns I recognized from the periphery of the incomplete map, the forbidden glyphs, the boundary markers that had held it in check for centuries. I gripped the rolled parchment in my hand, my knuckles white against the aged paper. It was no longer just ink on vellum, it was a weapon, a key. I knew its weaknesses, its hunger, its ancient prison. "I know you," I whispered into the vast emptiness, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. A gust of icy air, smelling of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt bone, swept through the chamber, extinguishing my lantern. This was its play, its attempt to disorient. My eyes, though useless in the black, were unnecessary. I had memorized the chamber's layout, every angle, every carved symbol. I had drawn it in my mind 1,000 times. I reached into my satchel, my fingers fumbling for the chalk I had brought. It was a special blend, ground from the same mineral deposits found in the deepest veins of the estate, imbued with the specific properties I had deduced from the marginalia of the ancestral texts. My hand, guided by an instinct honed by weeks of obsession, found the edge of the dais. Kneeling, I began to draw. The chalk scraped against the cold stone, a faint, almost inaudible whisper in the profound silence. I traced the precise lines of containment, the intricate geometric patterns that mirrored the estate's hidden ley lines, the boundaries that would bind it once more. As I drew, the thrumming intensified, a guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very stone. It pressed against me, a crushing weight, trying to force me to my knees, to break my concentration. "Fool! You merely draw your own cage." The words were not heard, but felt, a direct intrusion into the fortress of my mind. My head reeled, a sudden, blinding flash of disorientation. The air, sterile and metallic, prickled my nostrils. The rhythmic hiss-whoosh of unseen life support systems pulsed from behind closed doors. My breath hitched. This was its ultimate weapon, not raw power, but the erosion of my sanity, the promise of a living death. My resolve wavered, a hairline fracture appearing in the wall of my will. But then, a flicker of memory, the estate, the map, the faces of my ancestors, bound to this land, to this struggle. This was my burden. With a gasp, I tore my mind free from the sterile hallucination. The rough, cold stone was back beneath my fingers, the thrumming roar of the entity a violent symphony in my ears. My body trembled, but my hand, guided by an iron will, did not falter. I moved to the next section, tracing the final, crucial lines. The entity's assault intensified. The chamber itself seemed to warp, the walls breathing, the floor undulating beneath me. My head pounded, a drumbeat against my skull. Blood trickled from my nose, warm and metallic on my upper lip. The cost was beginning. Each line I drew felt like tearing a piece of myself away. My memories, my identity, seemed to fray at the edges, like old parchment crumbling. Was this the price? To save the land, to banish the evil, I had to become something less than myself. With a final, desperate surge of will, I completed the last sigil, connecting the intricate web of lines. The moment the chalk lifted from the stone, a deafening crack echoed through the chamber, a sound like ancient bedrock splitting apart. A searing, white light erupted from the dais, blinding me, forcing a choked cry from my lips. I lay gasping on the cold stone, my body racked with tremors, my mind a fractured landscape. The light faded, leaving behind a residual glow, just enough to illuminate the dais. The intricate pattern I had drawn now pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a cage of pure energy. The entity was contained. It was not empty. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, my head aching with a dull, persistent throb. The man staring back was a stranger. A fine network of white lines, like tiny, branching rivers, marred his skin, tracing the path of the lines I had drawn, etched into my very being. The entity was contained, but it had carved its victory into me. The knowledge, the burden, the battle. The estate was safe, for now. The cost was everything. The words were not heard, but felt, a direct intrusion into the fortress of my mind. My head reeled, a sudden, blinding flash of disorientation. For a terrifying instant, the cold, rough stone beneath my fingers vanished. I was no longer in the ancient chamber. The air, thin and sterile, held the metallic tang of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the damp earth I'd known. White walls stretched into a receding gloom, punctuated by closed doors, each a silent, impenetrable barrier. My own breath hitched, a shallow, ragged thing in my throat. I saw no one, heard no voice, only the quiet, tireless industry of machines existing without purpose, breathing for no one. A profound, aching loneliness settled over me, heavier than any physical burden. This was a place of waiting, of quiet suffering, yet it offered no solace, no promise of aid. It simply was, an indifferent void. Then, the floor bucked. Not the gentle sway of a ship, but a violent, sickening lurch that tore the sterile scene to tatters. The white walls warped, stretched like melting wax, and the rhythmic hum intensified to a shriek that clawed at the fragile walls of my skull. My vision swam, a kaleidoscope of gray and white, before snapping back with a brutal jolt. I was prone on rough-hewn stone, the familiar, earthy scent of the deep chamber filling my nostrils. Above me, the gaping maw of the shaft I had descended yawned, a ragged tear in the ceiling, letting in a sliver of bruised, late-afternoon light. The air was thick with dust and the acrid stench of something burned, something unnatural. My body screamed, every muscle a taut wire, every joint a grinding. Pivot. A dull, insistent ache throbbed behind my eyes, a souvenir of the mind's recent trespass. My clothes, once neat, were now torn, stained, and heavy with damp earth. The chamber around me was a charnel house of stone and shattered dreams. Where the ancient altar had stood, only a crater remained, a blackened gouge in the earth, still faintly smoking. Fragments of the obsidian map lay scattered like dead leaves, their malevolent gleam extinguished. The air, though still, thrummed with a residual, almost imperceptible vibration, like the dying echo of a colossal bell. It was gone. The entity, the consuming hunger, the malevolent presence that had haunted my lineage and burrowed into the very foundations of this estate, was gone. I stumbled through the passages, each step a testament to sheer will, not strength. The estate above was a grotesque caricature of its former self. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light piercing the wreckage, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Tapestries hung in shreds, furniture was overturned and crushed, and the very walls seemed to weep grit and plaster. It was as if a giant, unseen hand had swept through, not merely destroying, but erasing with savage contempt. The entity might be gone, but its touch lingered. I felt it in the faint, persistent itch on my skin, an echo of the insidious intrusion. A clarity, yes, a terrifying understanding of things that should remain veiled, but also a persistent hum beneath the surface, a faint resonance that was not entirely my own. I walked the perimeter of the property, a ghost in the twilight. The ancient trees, once silent sentinels, now stood scarred and broken, their branches snapped, their leaves brittle with a strange, unnatural blight. No bird sang. No insect buzzed. The outside world remained blissfully unaware. No alarms had sounded, no curious neighbor had called. And I, Reid, the cartographer, the meticulous man of lines and angles, was now a vessel for its aftermath. My body bore the scars, a jagged cut above my brow, a perpetual tremor in my hands, a profound exhaustion that settled into my bones like damp. But the deeper wounds were unseen, etched into the very fabric of my being. The world looked different now, imbued with a new, terrible layer of meaning. A fragment, a sliver of that ancient knowledge, that terrible understanding, now resided within me, a silent, uninvited guest. The cost of its banishment was not merely the ruin of the estate, but the irrevocable transformation of my own soul. The sudden shift from the cold, rough stone to the smooth, cool floor was jarring, a physical lurch that left me breathless. A low, rhythmic hum, like a distant, tired heart, vibrated through the floor, a sound both sterile and unsettling. My fingers, which had been tracing the glyphs in the chamber, now felt alien, smooth, and strangely numb. Where was the grit, the chill of the earth? My mind felt like a shattered mosaic, fragments of memory refusing to coalesce. The entity's voice, a silent scream within my skull, still echoed, but softer now, a distant thrumming behind my eyes. I was alone. Utterly, profoundly alone. The hallway stretched in both directions, identical doors lining its walls, each one a sealed mystery. No footsteps, no murmurs, no distant chatter. Only the quiet breathing of unseen machines, a monotonous lullaby of artificial life. What had happened? The last clear image was the map, completed, the final line drawn in the earth, the surge of power, the overwhelming presence. And then, the words. Not heard, but felt. A demand. A bargain. I touched my face, my hair, my clothes. They were my own, but felt different. Untouched, clean, as if I had just woken from a long, dreamless sleep. But the sleep had been anything but dreamless. It had been a violent, psychic maelstrom. I stumbled to my feet, my balance precarious. My reflection in a polished metal surface, a fire extinguisher casing, showed a face I recognized, yet didn't. They were too still, too ancient. Not a pain, not a loss, but an absence. A quiet space within me where a vibrant part had once resided. My passion for the intricate lines of ancient maps, for the forgotten histories, for the meticulous pursuit of truth, it was still there, but muted, like a bell rung underwater. Something else had taken its place. A quiet understanding of the earth beneath my feet, of the veins of power that ran through it. A connection. The entity had demanded a sacrifice. And I had given it. Not a life, not a limb, but a piece of my very essence. My fear. My doubt. My capacity for genuine, unburdened joy. They had been stripped away, leaving behind a stark, unyielding clarity. I was no longer merely a cartographer, I was a guardian. A keeper of the secret I had so desperately sought to uncover. The map had not merely been completed, it had been activated. And I, its final architect, had become its conduit. I walked, the hallway stretching before me, until I found an exit. A heavy, fire-rated door that opened with a soft hiss into a quiet street, bathed in the pale light of dawn. The air was crisp, clean, filled with the scent of dew and distant wood smoke. I was back. But the world was no longer the same. The colors seemed sharper, the sounds more distinct, as if a veil had been lifted, or perhaps a new one drawn. My return to the estate was an act of grim pilgrimage. I descended, not with trepidation, but with a sense of duty. The chamber was as I had left it, the final lines etched into the earth, pulsating with a faint, unseen energy. My map, the culmination of my obsession, lay unfurled on the stone table, its lines now complete, a terrifyingly accurate depiction of the estate's hidden heart. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the power it now contained. It was a key, a lock, and a warning. My days unfolded in a new rhythm. I continued my work, but with a different purpose. My meticulous nature, once a tool for discovery, was now a shield, a means to maintain order, to monitor, to protect. I spent hours in the chamber, not deciphering, but listening. The entity was contained, its raw power bound by the completed map, by the sacrifice I had made. But it was not gone. It was a quiescent force, a slumbering titan beneath the land, and I was its watchman. The world outside the estate seemed distant, its concerns trivial. Colleagues called, their voices thin and reedy over the telephone, inquiring about my prolonged absence. I offered vague explanations, citing illness, the demands of the estate. Their words held no true weight. How could they understand the seismic shift within me? I moved through my life, a ghost in my own skin. The fear was gone, replaced by a vigilant calm. But with fear, so too had gone the sharp edges of joy, the sting of sorrow, the vibrant hues of human emotion. I was a vessel, a keeper. The horror was contained, yes, but it was not over. It was a living, breathing thing within me, a constant hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. My victory was a gilded cage, and I, its willing, unwilling prisoner.